Hello everyone, this Headcanon Fodder was a request, nay, a challenge, to come up with a continuity for the Leprechaun films. A series, that's what happens when you construct a continuity out of not giving a fuck about continuity. The titular Leprechaun goes from 600 to 2000 years old between films. He literally never starts a film in the same condition that he left the last one. His powers and weaknesses are at best inconsistent, and what actually kills him can only be described as who gives a shit if this makes sense. To illustrate the sheer levels of not giving a crap, in the majority of the films, the Leprechaun's sole interest is getting his gold back. Except in two where he wants to get married. One of which is in space. In every film, he will murder people who have his gold, except in the one where having his gold protects you for some reason. He can always track down who has his gold, except when he can't, and when he doesn't need to because a rainbow appears. His powers, already changeable, are always weaker without his gold, except lol, nah, not usually. In fact, the closest thing to continuity in these films is the 8th film in the series being a straight sequel to the first.
Well, better late than never.
But even that had a completely different guy playing the Leprechaun.
When did I get better looking?
Apart from that, the best bit of continuity was Leprechaun 3 opening with the Leprechaun trapped in stone by a magic medallion with a red gem, after he'd ended the previous film being stabbed with an iron poker. And then Leprechaun 5 opened with a flashback to the 70s, and the Leprechaun is trapped in stone by a medallion with a red gem. So, continuity. Until they forgot about the red gem medallion and ended the film with him being a record executive in the modern day. And where did the leprechauns come from? In one film, he sold his soul for his gold. In another, leprechauns can have litters of kids with humans. In another, he indicates that they can reproduce with aliens. And a Leprechaun Back to the Hood, they're all magic demon things that were banished underground, all except the titular one. It wouldn't be quite so hard if he had a name beyond Leprechaun, because American screenwriters butchering random Irish names in each film like they butcher random Americans and the Irish culture were going to be somewhere to start, but nah, he's just the Leprechaun. Unless you go with a comic, where he's called Lubdan, and even that just adds more continuity issues. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that trying to make sense of these films and how they could possibly click together is where madness lies, so naturally I agreed to do it. I could cheat and say, oh, they're all just different leprechauns, they all look like Warwick Davies, and naturally gravitate towards murder in the sunnier parts of the United States. But nah, too easy. Besides, remember Back to the Hood, there can be only one.
The one that did not go back.
My first theory is simple and can't be proven wrong. They all take place in alternate universes. Done, dusted, but also unfalsifiable and utterly fucking boring, so it doesn't count. My second theory was that possibly the leprechauns were beings of pure belief, like the Candyman, which would line up with the Candyman vs. Leprechaun film that was actually pitched to Tony Todd at one point. Maybe their weaknesses and powers are controlled by people's beliefs, and there are as many leprechauns as people have beliefs about the leprechauns. This actually has a little bit of extra evidence. There's a black little person in 2 who basically declares that he's a leprechaun.
Yo, man, want me go?
Sure, it's also St. Patrick's Day, but he's also credited as African-American leprechaun, so maybe he is a leprechaun, but this directly contradicts the stuff from Back to the Hood. So this leads to my third and best theory, that the Leprechaun films are not in the correct order. Let's start off with Back to the Hood. Not the film itself, but the myth it starts off with. That the leprechauns were magical beings summoned and then banished into the ground, with only one left on the surface. The Warwick Davies leprechaun. Anyway, basically, the first film, from the leprechaun's point of view, is Leprechaun in the Hood, which he finishes as an extremely successful record executive. From there, we jump to Leprechaun in space, because who could afford to go to space and make contact with alien life before the human space military? Someone incredibly rich who began his fortune with a successful record company and developed an interest in space travel. The Leprechaun is this universe's answer to Richard Branson. Now that the Leprechaun has conquered the music business and even space, he's lost the need for his gold. He likes to have it, but unlike previous films, it's not all-encompassing. No, what he wants is to become king of space.
Do you know who I am? I am the daughter of a king.
And it is your royal blood, madame, that will make me a king.
It's a natural progression that I'm sure Branson is laying the groundwork for as we wait. The Leprechaun ends in space, being inflated and blown up. Sounds like the end, but earlier on the same thing happened and he regrew from his feet, so he can regenerate. And the fact that he regrew from his feet, which were in the best position to fight his enemies, proves that he has conscious control over what part of him regrows. If it was automatic, it'd be his head or the largest part. Okay, so he's left in space as the hero's spaceship flies off. What if their warp drive involves black holes? It's a commonly theorized method of space travel, and even turns up in fiction sometimes. Romulan ships in Star Trek use artificial black holes. Okay, so what if all the pieces of the Leprechaun are sucked into the black hole created by the ship and end up scattered through time, each landing in Ireland at different points? And because each piece cannot feel the presence of the others, they believe and act like they're the only piece. So all regenerate into different Warwick Davies leprechauns, who are all equally successors to the one from In the Hood and In Space. These splinters, evolving over time, is why there are subtle and not so subtle differences between them in character, drive and weaknesses. But what they all have in common is that they all love the sunnier climes of the USA. They are also driven to destroy each other because on some level they realise there should be only one of them. This is why that rule that leprechauns will always try to kill each other in two exists.
A leprechaun is very territorial. He can never tolerate another leprechaun crossing his boundaries.
Someone saw two of them fighting and it became a generic part of the leprechaun myth. But how does this line up with the Leprechaun in 2 biting this twerp and turning him into a were-leprechaun?
Scott, come over to the green side. I'll make you rich.
Simple, he wasn't actually turning into one. That whole thing was the Leprechaun magically fucking with them. And how do I integrate the African-American leprechaun? It'd be much too simple to have him just be a human, so I have 2 possibilities. 1, the rule in Back to the Hood where the leprechauns had to go underground was later rescinded, so he's just hanging out. Or 2, Leprechaun Returns reveals that when regenerating from the brink of death, the leprechaun can change his appearance quite dramatically.
When did I get better looking?
So what if the African-American leprechaun was one of the Warwick Davies splinters, who nearly died, regenerated into a black guy, and chilled out, happy to celebrate St. Patrick's Day in a sunny part of the USA? But after all that, what about Origins? I can't have forgotten Origins. That splinter clearly landed a little later than the others, and has yet to get beyond the savage phase of leprechaun development. You see 2 talks about leprechaun babies, and it sounds like they start out pretty animalistic.
You'll get used to the pain. We'll have to make some changes to your face as well. But the wee ones won't suckle if you don't look like them. They can be very demanding at times.
Or maybe it just went wrong. It's a leprechaun, I doubt it's a foolproof process. So yeah, there you go, my official order of the Leprechaun films. In the Hood, In Space, 1, 2, 3, Back to the Hood, Origins and Returns. There was one leprechaun who was in the Hood and in space, and then 5 successor leprechauns who were equally descended from him but still variations on a theme. But how does this line up with the occasional references from splinter leprechauns to their mother or having sold their soul? Simple, they remember the events of their previous life, like the regrown leprechaun in 3 remembered his previous life. But the memory is fallible. Having gone over this a few times, which is more than the makers of the Leprechaun films did, the only real issue is that the red gem medallion has 2 versions of him frozen in stone at the same time, in 3 and in the Hood. But honestly, if you can make 1 leprechaun freezing medallion, you can probably make 2. So what do you think? And more importantly, do you think I should regret marathoning these films?